So my research was on the 2000 presidential election. I concentrated on the fallout of the Supreme Court decision in Bush v. Gore, Bush v. Gore of 2000, and the the lunacy that took place over 36 days from Election Day, November 7, to the Supreme Court ruling on December 12th, which ended the vote recounts in Florida and allowed the vote count to stay as it was, Bush being the winner of Florida and becoming president. The controversy that surrounded this for the last 20 years is full of conspiracy theories and claims that the Supreme Court, in a partisan 5-4 vote, 5 Republicans voting over 4 Democrats to put Bush into office, and violation of federalism, violation of states' rights, and the judicial activism, and just lots and lots of claims. And I honestly think they're all somewhat crazy. If you look at what actually came down, how it actually played out, it's very clear to see that the central issue pertains to the Florida Supreme Court. And when we look at what the Florida Supreme Court was doing, it's only logical that the U.S. Supreme Court had to intervene to protect states' rights, to protect equal protection of the individual voters, to protect our entire constitutional order. In essence, the Florida Supreme Court was way out of line. And in the first decision, there were 2 decisions, 2 Supreme Court cases came out of this election. In the first, Bush v. Palm Beach County, the Supreme Court conceded to hear the case, and they requested from the Florida Supreme Court some information from them regarding their extending the vote count deadline. So the vote count, you have the election, and then you have the deadline to count the votes, and then the Florida Secretary of State would certify the votes. The Gore sued, wanted a hand recount, was granted a hand recount, but the deadline came for certification. The hand recount wasn't done, and Gore sued, and all this went into motion. And then Bush appealed to have the hand recount stopped. The Supreme Court questioned the Florida Supreme Court on their decision to intervene and to allow the hand recount and to extend the vote count, questioned the constitutionality of what they had done, essentially asking the Florida Supreme Court, did you violate Florida state law in extending the vote count after the election? So the date for the votes to be counted, established before the election, per the Florida legislature, the Florida Supreme Court intervenes, extends that. And George Bush says, no. This is a violation of Florida state law. The Supreme Court they're acting politically. They're acting partisan. This needs to have a stop. Florida Supreme Court receives the information from the U.S. Supreme Court, ignores the U.S. Supreme Court, does not respond to them, and a few days later, they intervene again to extend the recount further so that more votes can be counted. And all of this is complete lunacy, because the problem is the Florida Supreme Court, who were all Democrats, a couple of them in the second decision after the U.S. Supreme Court intervened, a couple of them said, no, we're not going to vote to extend it again, but the majority of still voted to extend in a heavily partisan push to keep going, ignoring the prior intervention of the U.S. Supreme Court, sort of implying if you can't correct this, we will intervene to do so. And on December 8th, when the Florida Supreme Court extended it for a second time, the following day, on the 9th, the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and halted all vote counts pending a decision from them. So being ignored by the Florida Supreme Court obviously was not very well liked by the vast majority of those on the U.S. Supreme Court. And in fact, in a bipartisan decision, Bush v. Gore delivered two different holdings. The first one was that the Florida Supreme Court's decision to extend the deadline, not just once but twice, was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And that was a bipartisan vote, 7-2. So two of the Democrats on the Supreme Court voted with the 5 Republicans that, this was a clear violation of the Equal Protection Clause. The second holding, which is the controversial holding in the decision, was that in the time remaining under both state and federal law, there was not enough time to finish a recount, and so the Supreme Court was intervening and putting an end to all recounts in Florida. The votes stand as they do. And that was 5-4 down party lines. And that's the decision to end the recount that got everybody's feathers all ruffled. But based on, and the U.S. Supreme Court based their decision on a comment by the Florida Supreme Court that Florida state law mandated that the election, that the votes be counted by within 6 days of the federal law, when the electors would be presented to certify the counts for all 50 states. And that was on the 18th. So the count had to be completed by the 12th by state law and by the 18th by federal law. And this count had been going on back and forth at this point for 36 days, and they were not close to finishing the count, which is why the Supreme Court said, there's just not enough time, and everybody started having hissy fits, and that's just how it was. But this wasn't an act by the Supreme Court. They showed a hesitancy to get involved into this because it was a states' rights issue. But when the Florida Supreme Court was obviously acting in partisan ways to push every boundary possible to get Gore into office, and where the recounts were requested in 4 different counties were all counties that voted heavily in favor of Gore over Bush. And when the Supreme Court started looking in and basing their decision on things, they saw that there were so many different methods of counting, varying from precinct to precinct and county to county, that it was a complete mess, and it was not being done in any sort of orderly manner, and it had a heavy hand of partisanship favoring Gore and discounting Bush, literally discounting Bush. So all of the conspiracy theory with Bush v. Gore. I think that it's really all nonsense when you look at what went on and how the Florida Supreme Court was really the issue, and that the U.S. Supreme Court was stepping in to protect the rights of voters and to really hold the constitutional order in place. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.